Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Psychology 360 podcast. Today, I have with me Dr. Marc Witmann joining me from Germany. And Dr. Witmann, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm hello, first of all, Simon. I'm a psychologist, and as a psychologist, experimental psychologist, neuroscientist, work in the field of time perception. So I really want to find out how we as humans perceive time, why it sometimes slows down, why it speeds up, the same time interval, let's say the same physical time interval. And yeah, I'm also interested in other states of consciousness because these sometimes very much change our perception of time. And I'm located here for 10 years now in Freiburg at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health. And yeah, and we'll talk about what I'm doing, I guess, in the next few minutes and an hour, perhaps.
Yes, great. And how did you get interested in this topic? Because the concept of time and time and space and consciousness is something that is quite fascinating. And I have to say, having heard some of your talks, one of the things that I remember and that I use quite a lot is that we are embodied time. And I believe that was you who said it. And yeah, so tell me a little bit about how you got interested.
Well, the embodied time thing actually goes back even to phenomenologists. So actually philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he already talked about this in his philosophical analysis of perception. And but you could say complementary to that, as an empirical scientist, one of my big, I think, research findings is when I was in San Diego for 5 years, between 2004 and 2009, doing fMRI studies. I found out that the insular cortex insular cortex activity is very much related to time perception in the range of several seconds. And the insular cortex is the brain region which is responsible, important for interoception. So interoception meaning the perception of body signals. And so there were, of course, then I made the link that maybe, so how do we perceive time? Because we don't see time, we don't hear time, we don't smell time, if you want. Maybe we perceive time through our bodily self, through the embodiment of us as human beings. Body signals come in constantly. We might judge duration.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. And have you, because I know in research there's quite a bit of talk about the perception of time going slower or going faster, which is often painted with affect. So somebody's at a dentist's office is going to feel time dragging on. Somebody who's at a party or doing something that is enjoyable kind of ends up in a state of flow, or doing maybe even something like work that is enjoyable can have this state of flow. So basically you're saying that this is very often connected with body signals, and could you give some examples of that, like related to, because interoception is a bit tricky to find.
So you, of course, already named a lot of everyday examples, which are very good, actually, also in explaining already what from cognitive science one knows. Yeah, so we have this cognitive model, for example, by Sakai and Bloch, the pacemaker accumulator model, which state that one mechanism of how we perceive time is, or one modulator of time, how we perceive time, is through attention. So the more we pay attention to time, the longer subjective duration. So for example, a classic waiting situation, boredom situation, you're attending to time and then time drags. But let's say you're absorbed in a fantastic conversation or in a super thrilling movie, you lose your sense of time, you're not attending to time, and then time passes very quickly. So that's one modulator. The second modulator is arousal. So again, in this cognitive model, so the higher arousal, the faster a pacemaker is functioning, and the more some sort of cognitive impulses are accumulated over time, and the number of pulses define subjective duration. So if you're some sort of in an exciting situation where you're also actually attending to time, then you feel that time is dilating. So you have these two modulators, attention to time and arousal. But these now I complement with my ideas on the embodiment of time, because you could ask, so where do we attend to if we attend to time? There is no time. I'm not speaking about the clock, clock time, not that. Right. So, but still we can speak of perception of time. And so this is attending to time means attending to yourself, to your bodily self. And arousal as the second mechanism is feeling your bodily self more, because you're more emotionally aroused, and then again, time stretches. So I would say I complement this, and then you gave the perfect examples like waiting time, you're bored, you're waiting for the bus, you feel yourself suddenly, you're projecting yourself onto yourself. So it's a feedback that you're suddenly experiencing yourself, and then time drags. But let's say you're at this bus stop and you're, let's say, talking to someone, and you're totally in this conversation. You don't feel yourself. You don't feel your bodily self because you're in this conversation, and then time passes very quickly.
So basically, when somebody, and from pure cognitive perspective, when somebody is focusing the attention on something external, it's more likely that the time perception will be altered in the sense that it will move faster. Okay, because because we know that that's also connected with lowered anxiety. So very often people who are focusing on their inner states tend to be a little bit more behaviorally and socially inhibited. But on the other hand, if they start to learn how to focus on the outside, and that is something that's very common that I recommend with people with anxiety who may come to me, is basically teach them how to do that. So that's very interesting. And on top of that, so you did MRI, so functional MRI studies related to time perception, because I want to bring that in because we are currently also doing some research here in Prague related to ADHD and time perception. And basically one of the new theories related to ADHD is that it is very intrinsically connected with this altered sense of time perception, where there's difficulties with time estimation and with just feeling like time is passing by, or that they are not able to have enough agency, and that time is kind of flowing by and they're not.
And they cannot wait for something to happen.
Yeah. So that's, and did you see that in specific, like with the MRI studies, were you and your team looking at specific disorders or people who had?
So what we did in a follow-up study with this first fMRI study, which I talked about, where we just had normal subjects, students from the University of San Diego. Then the second one was we compared, again, normal subjects, which was important in the age of replication crisis. Just replicating it 2 years later, and we just find basically the same results with our control subjects, with this insular activation. And then we also looked at not specifically ADHD, but they could have had also ADHD, but we took the umbrella term of impulsivity. So we specifically looked for people who are in the Barrett impulsivity scale, so a subjective questionnaire, exceeded a certain value, and those we included in a second group of high impulsive individuals. And there we could show that they basically overestimated duration very much. In a reproduction task, this means that they pressed a button earlier than the control subjects. And this was also related to less future time perspective that they appear to have. So they're more present oriented, which fits the picture of impulsive individuals, who may be more hedonistically present oriented. That fits this Zimbardo time perspective model. And then the results with fMRI were a little ambiguous, not so clear clearly didn't appear so clearly. We also could show insular activation in these subjects, but it was not as prominent as in the control subjects. Yeah? So in the control subject, we had a very nice slope of increasing activation with longer duration, which stopped at the end of the interval. And this is a very nice increasing slope. And with the more impulsive individuals, there was much more variance, and it was much less, the slope was much less clear delineated. So, but statistically, it was difficult to show the differences, but still we could say, okay, behaviorally different and neurally different.
Okay, so that's very interesting. And just so for the people who are listening or gonna watch this, the difference between time perception and time perspective. So we mentioned the time perspectives, and time perspectives refer to the amount of, let's say, the cognitive load that a person is placing on either the past, present, or future. And it's related to Zimbardo's time perspective inventory and the theories. Basically, a person is living day-to-day experiences either based on the past, and it can be past positive, where person has a rosy vision of the past and is comparing life every day to that, or a negative, where the person has negative experiences that can be trauma and is then influenced by these experiences in a day-to-day life. Then we have the present hedonist that you mentioned, which is more impulsivity, so living in the moment, seeking thrills. Present fatalist, which is things are happening, take them as fate, as kind of just happening. So I would say it's similar to an external locus of control. And then the future orientation, which has been changed to future positive and future negative as well, or updated. And how would you differentiate between time perspectives and just time perception in general?
Yeah, so the time perspectives, I would say, or time orientations are more like cognitive constructs of where in the, let's say, your narrative self, so mostly narrative self is heading at the moment. Yeah, let's say I project myself into to the next weekend, where I'll visit my friends. So this, and I'm happy about this. This would be something like a more positive future perspective. Or I'm looking at some exams that I'll have in a few months' time. Yeah, because I will have some. I'm very ambitious. I want to fulfill some of these study criteria. Or I'm looking back, yeah? So having memory. So this is always the narrative self, yeah? Being happy or bad about your future or past selves. And even with the fatalistic present orientation, it's more the rumination about, oh, the world is bad, maybe, yeah? So I cannot do anything, I'm helpless. Yeah, these are all ruminations related to the default mode network of the brain, to the narrative self, where we construct a world around us within these time dimensions. And time perception is more this immediate sense of passage of time, or the immediate sense of duration, or your judgment of, oh, this lasted too long, this lasted too short, when we're talking about seconds reigns or minutes reigns. Yeah? But then it has been shown that these two can be interconnected. Yeah? So first of all, via emotion, that people who are very negative, past-oriented, that they in general have these negative narratives. They also, because of their negativity, at the present moment, because of course it means at the present moment you're activating your past memories. And then you feel worse and you have more activated, let's say higher arousal, you're more anxious. And this higher arousal, for example, leads then, let's say, to an overestimation of duration at the present moment. So but also meaning time perspective and time perception can be quite related. Also longer time scales, they can be related. Someone who's very future oriented in general also will say, oh, the time today passed more quickly. You're more future oriented with your goals, which is actually quite good in general, because future oriented people, they have better jobs because they did their homework and they studied more, because of this future orientation. But there's also a downside, because then they may lose some of the qualities of the immediate present moment. And so then for them time passes more quickly. So you have several intricate relationships between time perspective and time perception, which are only now being started research is starting and evaluating these, because beforehand you had, let's say, two also cultures of time psychology cultures. One culture was more time orientation, time perspective. The other culture was more time perception, time estimation, and more experimental work. And so they were really separate. And now more and more, me and other colleagues of mine are starting now to look at these, the combination on the interactions of these two domains.
Right. And by the way, that's something we're doing now as well with the ADHD research. So we're looking at time perspectives as well as these time estimation tasks done digitally. So it's very interesting. And one thing that came to my mind when you were speaking about the reactivity or emotional reactivity would be interesting to look at personality and trait differences and time perspectives, because I'm not sure if somebody is doing that or if there is any data on that, but that would be fascinating to get.
You mean personality and time perception?
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
of course. When the Zimbardo is already a personality type, you could say. We have impulsivity. Impulsivity, I think, is the best predictor for time perception in the seconds range. Yeah? The more impulsive people are, the more they, in general, overestimate duration. So any study I've done using the impulsivity questionnaires, which is about the personality of an individual, propensity to be more or less impulsive, always, never ever did I find no results. So always related to time perception. So this overestimation of time.
Okay, yeah, and that makes sense. The impulsivity factor and the need for stimulation would be something that would make the time. People might get bored.
Another area where we have a good connections, or I always find connections, mindfulness, this construct of mindfulness, where you could say this could also be a mindfulness present orientation, actually, because it means in general in life, you're more aware of what's happening right now. This also can be shown to relate to time perception. So for example, the last 2-3 weeks might have passed more slowly for people who are more mindfulness. Why? Because you could argue, because they are more aware of what's passing around you, what in experience, then they accumulate more memory traces. And then in retrospect, when you look back at the last week, the last month, you have more memory traces to actualize, and then time dilates relatively to other people.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. And so you would, because I remember there was some talk about adding some kind of like present mindful state as well, in addition to the other two which we mentioned.
Yeah.
But yeah, so mindfulness isn't always helpful for people. I mean, in examples when you would have people in pain, for example, I would say something like hypnosis could be more helpful, because it's basically like bringing more dissociation rather than mindfulness and interoception. And going back to interoception, then would you say that mindfulness is leading to a higher level of interoception, or are people who already have more interoception more likely to seek something like mindfulness?
Yeah, that is of course a tricky question you never can answer if you don't do longitudinal studies. Yeah. So now, of course, we got the correlation. This is the hypothesis. So also there, the results are mixed. Yeah, with is interoception related, correlated with mindfulness, and from a face validity, it should be. But now, if you're going to studies, there's mixed results. It also depends on which, if you have questionnaires or if you have real objective tasks. So, for example, heart rate detection tasks, where you have to count your heartbeats and then related to objective heartbeats and how accurate are you.
Mhm.
And I think there's much more to be done, but in general, I think the hypothesis is out there, and there are some indications that people are more aware of their bodily self. Those are also people who are more mindful. There is a correlation in that. But again, here, I think research is just starting. So interoception in psychology is also something you can go back to always find some pockets of research, but also that has just started over the last 10, 15 years to be done systematically.
Right. Yeah, and exactly. And that's why I was saying at the beginning, it's also a term that is not always easy to define, how interoception is measured or how you define it. And basically, like the way I understand it, it's basically your awareness, of your sensations and things and processes within your body. But yeah, it sounds very tricky to me.
Which are of course also subjective, yeah.
Right.
And can be a discrepancy between what you think, how you are aware of yourself, and how you are actually accurate with your judgments, yeah.
Mhm.
So therefore, you also have objective tasks, like Sarah Garfinkel, a neuroscientist from now UCL. She has done a lot of studies on this, showing that there is potentially a discrepancy between what you think, how you think you are aware of yourself, and actual detection abilities. So people might say, oh, I feel my heart and I feel it very closely. But then if you ask them to count, let's say, the heartbeats for a certain time interval, they're totally off, meaning actually they're not very accurate. Huh? So there's always the subjective and the objective side to it.
That makes sense. And if I may ask, like these research that you're doing, how do you apply them in day-to-day life, or how do you see them? What is their utility in the long run?
Well, there's several different things. Now, going back to, let's say, the question of, so now, for example, now to give an example of my day-to-day business at the moment, I have an EU project running where we're looking at flow states in relation to subjective time. And how we want to tackle that is using video games, because this is an ideal example, or let's say experimental paradigm. If you ask a gamer, everyone will tell you, oh, that when they're gaming, they're absolutely in the flow state. They lose track of time. They lose track of their personal selves, yeah, because they're so absorbed in the presence of this game, even maybe in VR, virtual reality, which we're also using as a technology. And so we're having actually now normal people playing games, train them beforehand, but also using gamers. So similar to my other studies where we use meditators, experienced meditators who come into my lab and then meditate, and we take EEG and we take physiological parameters like breathing and heart rate. We do the same thing like with experienced gamers, because there we have a very nice paradigm where we can easily control for the effects of subjective time and self. And that's what's happening right now. I think now, actually, just at the moment, we have a gamer in our EEG lab, and he's playing a video game, and we're recording his EEG, and then also afterwards asking how fast he thought time had passed on his flow states. And we're going through a replay of his video game again and seeing where he experienced what. And so we'll really get a very close up to what's happening in the video game. So that's one of the studies I'm conducting now.
Yeah, as an ex-gamer, I can definitely attest to experiences where I would be in front of a computer playing a game, and 3-4 hours passed by and I had no idea. I looked at the clock after I was playing and I was shocked. I said, oh wow, I didn't get hungry, I forgot to eat, and I was just totally absorbed. So I can certainly relate to that, and that's very interesting. And I mean, now there's quite a bit of interest in the topic of flow states. I know there's writers like Jamie Wheel who look at this type of state of mind to raise creativity, to kind of try to induce it. And so basically, do you look at that at all? Like people who may be more creative or who are, love what they do and are getting into these flow states while also.
Yeah, I think Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, yeah, the flow, the inventor of this name and the concept of flow, yeah, in the 1970s, he has done a lot of that, yeah. So he has done a lot of qualitative studies, just like you suggested, yeah, with creative people, artists, and so on. And so this was very, very helpful for conceptualizing his ideas. But now what we're trying to do is, let's say, more, not so much on the subjective qualitative side, but more on the objective and quantitative side to really, and then even finding EEG correlates. And so there it's of course best to have several subjects who are very like-minded, have very similar skills, like for example, these gamers, and get them into our lab and to objectify all these concepts. Yeah? So that's my approach now at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's great. We did a little bit of a pilot study here with white noise and partial sensory deprivation to look at that kind of not flow state, but kind of more dissociation and time perception as well. And
that's cool. We have to, besides this interview, we have to talk about this because I also use this Gunsfeld technique. Where you get, let's say, one light shining into your through goggles into your field of view, red or green, and then you have something like brown noise, like sounding like a waterfall over your ears, and then we had the people for 25 minutes in both with counterbalanced order, red and green light. And then also asking about time and self. And interestingly, because you're now saying this, we also found that people got into hypnosis-like states. Yeah? So if you looked at the subjective questionnaires, yeah, the inventories, what they said, they had a similar pattern to what people under hypnosis report. Yeah? Okay. And again, what we also found was that green light led to more relaxation and to a stronger underestimation of time than red light. So red light also was more arousal related and green light more relaxation related.
Okay, so yeah, when we did that, we only tried the red light, but that's interesting and would be a good idea to change up the lights and see what happens. And just for people who don't know what the Ganzfeld effect is, how would you describe it? And besides just the classic definition, how would you explain it? What's happening with the brain, or like with the input? Why does it happen?
Yeah, so I think Wolfgang Metzger in 1929 published a paper. He's a Gestalt psychologist, the early experimental psychologist. Basically not having it with goggles, but having people in a chamber with just one monochrome light exposure, so you couldn't see anything. It's like James Turrell artwork, you could say. Yeah? James Turrell, the artist who works with these light atmosphere rooms. And what we have here now is so it's more easily to handle. We have goggles which shine light directly onto you so that you only see green light or only see red light in your whole visual field. Yeah? And then we are having people seated on a very comfortable chair so they can put their neck back and they're relaxed. Then we have earphones where they're exposed to what we call brown noise, yeah, meaning it sounds like a dark waterfall, which is for a lot of people very relaxing. And then we have people exposed to this reduced reduced stimulation, sensory stimulation, for, in our case, 25 minutes, and have them just be in this state. And then record before and afterwards their subjective states. And there you can really then find out about how, you could say it's something like an meditation induction you reproduce. Yeah? Because very often people have problems in really staying relaxed for 25 minutes in a seated position, because then their mind wanders off, and then they feel their back pain, and it's quite hard for a lot of people to meditate. But there you have a means which is a step easier to get into some sort of relaxation states through this light and this acoustic stimulation. And then, as I said, you get into hypnosis, meditation type states very easily.
Okay, yeah, and because from my experience, having tried it and having used more of the white noise, which sounds more like static, when the old
Yeah.
CDs
It's
were
more uncomfortable, actually. The brown noise is much more comfortable, yeah?
yeah.
Because it has more the lower frequencies.
Okay, yeah, because I've noticed that using the white noise, it was quite there could be quite strong reactions from it, including hallucinatory states. And so I noticed that, and so that's very interesting to change and make more.
This combination of red light and white noise is very often, well, has been done in a lot of parapsychological studies, because what it does, it induces then a lot of something like, yeah, as you say, hallucinations, yeah, visually, and because it's more arousing, the red light, plus the white noise is some sort of, you always try and you think you're hearing some meaningful things, yeah, like whispers or some traffic noise or something. And then parapsychologists use this as a method to induce something like precognition or some hallucinatory states where they could have some clairvoyance impressions.
Yeah.
Yeah? And it's clear why this is so, because you get a lot of impressions through this technology. Yeah? And that's why they like to use it. But for this, in the case of you want to have people more getting into meditation states, relaxation states, it's better to have brown noise and green light.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's really good. And I can imagine that, yeah, with the modern, fast-paced society, it's harder. It's very difficult for many people to just sit down, follow their breath, and do get into this state of consciousness, meditative state. I have to say, I did an interview earlier today with a doctor on the endocannabinoid system. And she was telling that we have a very hyperactive endocannabinoid system where we are constantly getting information. And actually something like CBD, and this is kind of out of the topic, but something like CBD, cannabidiol, actually inhibits something like the CB1 receptor. So it makes us more relaxed and possibly can connect with the topics we're talking about as well. And
there's actually studies out done in Holland or something, yeah, we're showing that cannabinoids affect on time perception.
Yeah, well, that's been
also
for a long time, even with THC and the the appearance that time is slowing down. And I wanted to ask you also wrote a book called Altered States. And yeah, Altered States of Consciousness. And could you tell me, what else have you been exploring? I mean, in terms of time perception and techniques, because you just mentioned something like the brown noise, the relaxation states. Have you done anything else? Because I know I'm very interested in things like the sensory deprivation tanks, John Lilly's work. So are you also doing those kind of things?
Yeah, so I visited Justin Feinstein in Tulsa, who is doing really systematic work on this. And then this might be also interesting for you, because what he showed in his first now 2 studies published is that already a one-time exposure of a session in the floating tank reduces anxiety in individuals with anxiety issues, disorders, strong anxiety disorders, remarkable. And now they're doing these follow-up studies with having people coming in once or twice a week, like therapy sessions. And the hopeful is that through this very tender, calm intervention, if you compare it to pharmacological interventions, you can have really strong effects. And it seems like the first results are very promising. Again, most people probably will know this method of the floating tank. So you're in warm temperature water, which has exactly body temperature. It's salt water, so you're floating on this water and you cannot go under. Then let's say it's dark because you have the light is shut off. You don't hear anything, you don't see anything. The only thing you're exposed to is your inner bodily self. Therefore, at the beginning, you sense time actually quite intensely. Yeah? And of course, your narrative chatter at the beginning, what I'm doing here is this, and so on, that goes on. But if you stay there, because it's so relaxing, normally you don't get bored. Most people don't get bored because it's very relaxing. It's just like having, as if you were just floating and having something like a different form of massage. And it's warm water that's also very, very calming and nice. And then you just stay in there and suddenly your mind chatter goes off, just like in meditation. So I had this in my third session, being at Justin Feinstein's lab in Tulsa. And in the third session, I had my last, I remember my last impression or my last thought was, oh, I have no thoughts anymore. And my narrative chatter totally went down. I was just in there. Yeah? Mm. And so this was a strong well, experience. And so I also talk about a little bit about the floating tank in my book, but of course there the studies are just starting, so I didn't write too much about it. What I also wrote about was psychedelics. Yeah? So psychedelics also, I did studies with Franz Vollenweider in Zurich, and published in 2007 and 2008. So where we looked at the time perception changes under the influence of psychedelics like psilocybin. And so in the book, where I go through all sorts of induction techniques, which you can do psychologically or pharmacologically, and what happens in the brain, what happens to you in your experience. And basically what really summarize everything is that through these different induction techniques, very often at the peak experiences, there's no time, no self. This is the peak experience of most induction techniques. What I also have is in one bigger chapter about psychiatric disorders, where I talk about depression, schizophrenia, also epileptic seizures, of the Dostoevsky type seizures, yeah, which were so impressive for Dostoevsky because he totally had some sort of eternal bliss he felt, yeah, again, losing in the end his sense of self and time. And there's now also neurological studies looking at this systematically, these epileptic auras, as they're called. And yeah, so I really summarize the field, what is there out there. Additionally, also near-death experiences, again, what people, we looked at the data bank, near-death experience, where people just write down what they experience. And again, in most cases, people lose this complete sense of time at these peak experiences. So I try to summarize altered states of consciousness. What is the most important, essential top features of these altered states of consciousness? For me now in my research is this losing sense of self and time. And that's what I'm summarizing in that book.
Okay, and that sounds a lot like the description that is often given as ego death, where the ego kind of dies or temporarily dies.
What dies is a little harsh. Yeah, maybe you transcend the ego. Yeah.
Okay.
Because of course you're coming back to your egoic processes.
Yeah, and it can be a real, like, let's say, initiatic experience for some that you can.
It can be a spiritual experience. So even epileptic auras for some people can be a spiritual experience. Yeah, and of course meditation, psychedelics. I think that is that's why a lot of people, of course, do these things, also recreational things, because they suddenly come into touch with a different way of sensing the world, getting a different perspective on consciousness, on the world, yeah, getting less rigid in your everyday thoughts, because you now have a complete different sense of what you are and how you experience. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I know that now it's quite popular to take psychedelics at a minimal dose, so do microdosing, so where it's not very like psychoactive dose, and Did you look at that at all, Eric? Because I know many people are doing that, and then they say they even describe using the time better or being more mindful. So have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, of course. Well, one thing, of course, in Germany, you cannot really systematically do this kind of research. So you're lucky that you're in Prague, in Czech Republic, yeah, where you actually can do it. You can do it in Switzerland, Franz Vollenweider, his team. Then there's Professor Lichty in Basel who is doing it. Then, of course, at UCL, you have a strong group, but with Carhart Harris and Nutt, these two researchers who then, but they really had to fight for being able to do that. And in the US, you're doing some of this research. And in Germany now, maybe in Mannheim with the Professor Gründer, he's a psychiatrist, it's now starting. The very first for many, many decades or years and decades that the study is starting in psychiatry. But looking, of course, on the effects of psychedelics on psychiatric disorders. So it's hard to do it yourself when you're living in Germany. So I have to do systematic studies on other induction methods like meditation, Ganzfeld, etc.
Right. Well, which, quite to be honest, from my experience, the breathing techniques and things like I did a lot of Wilhelm Reich's techniques with breath work, and I have to say they were probably some of the strongest experiences I felt. Quite intensive. So yeah, it's not any less. But I have to ask, in Germany, there's this taboo because of what's the reason behind it?
I don't know, I think worldwide stopped in 71, US stopped, but there was this ideological fights in the 1960s, around this movement of 1980. Yeah. 71, the US started with stop the consummation or research with any drug. It was just the same. Groff had to stop also his psychedelics research, and that's why he started then this breathing technique. Yeah,
right.
And then everywhere it was forbidden, and only slowly in around the year 2000, a little earlier, Franz Vollenweider in Switzerland could start again, but that was just a local happening, yeah, because he knew the people from the federal offices, and then they did some pilot studies with him, and it all worked well, and then he got going. And then, then we're talking about England, and it's just 10 years ago that they started again in England and UCL. And then of Prague and other places, or in Barcelona with ayahuasca, and of course in Brazil, you can do it also with ayahuasca. So it's just starting now again after this ban from the 1970s, and now it's starting getting traction again.
Okay, and that's interesting. Let's hope that this trend continues and that people will be able to get access to these substances, because I think that they can be quite helpful within the field of psychiatry. And there's been quite a lot of data, especially from the 1960s, 1950s, on their use for addiction. And even recently with magic mushroom, psilocybin, and cocaine addiction and nicotine addiction. So it's definitely something to look into. And I wanted to ask you, is there, from your book and from your studies, what was the most surprising thing that you have found, or that kind of struck you in terms of time perception or altered states of consciousness?
I can still recall the situation where I was in my office desk in San Diego at the VA hospital, and where I, for the first time, plotted my results from the brain imaging study. And I didn't know what to expect. So, because before that the paradigmatic area of the brain which always was related to time was where this was a stratum in the basal ganglia. And you had frontal cortex activity too, and you had SMA. So these are just different structures in the brain, or cerebellum. So a lot of different structures which have been said or have been shown to be somehow related to areas in the brain. But then I did a study. These were all related more to millisecond timing and to a few seconds timing. And so I had now suddenly long time intervals, which was important for me because I wanted to have an experience of real time, long time. So then I had 3 seconds, 9 seconds, and 18 seconds, which had to be reproduced. And there I know I plotted the thing, and I had several areas of interest from the classic contrast methods you have with a control task. So and then just I looked at these little spots, and then I plotted the curves to all these different spots, among them insula, but also basal ganglia, frontal cortex. And only in insula we saw this fantastic slope increase over time, which peaked at the end of the to be timed interval. And this was, I think, this was one of the most important moments in my career, when I suddenly saw this really convincing result. So it's not just like a statistical test and you do, oh yeah, it's more active than a control condition or something like this, but you really see it in these slopes, this activity increasing and ending, which is very convincing. I think this was maybe my most impressive moment in my research time.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, and did that impact how the understanding of time perception is seen in the general public or within the field?
Well, it's now just yet another idea or theory. So now insula comes to it. I also have a good colleague, so Bud Craig, who is a functional neuroanatomist, who already actually at the same time also voiced his opinion that the insula will be involved in time perception. So he had this from a theoretical point of view, he said this, and I had suddenly this empirical data, which was fantastic. And we voiced this too in the 2009 papers, parallel papers. And then my empirical data came out in 2010. And so this is, I would say, another, it's an ongoing debate, and it also depends on many factors. One factor is the duration we're talking about. Is it more sensory motor processing, fast sensory motor processing? Or is it, and that's my claim, in longer intervals when you really feel time and thus your bodily self, then insula is involved.
And from a, let's say, philosophical perspective, we know that the idea of time, as we understand it, like we look at history in terms of linear time, it's something, well, it's not so new, but it was something that the Persians had come up with, that before, kind of like in ancient Greece, in the ancient world, time was understood more in terms of cycles. And today we can also see in more agricultural societies, clocks may not be as useful as things like, the sunrise and just like, let's call them cosmic events. So is that something that what's your opinion on that?
I mean, we have this cyclical time. We actually have also very much embodied, because I mean, just think about the circadian rhythms.
Right.
We're there talking about 24 hours rhythm, which are totally embodied. So our whole body system has several hundreds, thousands of inner clocks, which are all orchestrated, coordinated through sunlight, so to function as one clock, if you want. And only if you, let's say, go out of the sun in these famous bunker experiments where you had students working for weeks for exams and they were without any impression of sunlight, and then you could see that the different internal clocks for different physiological cognitive functions ran out of sync. But normally they're all synchronized through sunlight. But there you can see that we as humans, embodied humans, have already cyclical time ingrained. This governs our weak sleep cycle, of course, and everything. So also our cognitive capacities, our digestion system, whatever, physiology of the body is cyclical, in 24 hours rhythms.
Yeah, and we could also mention the fact that we're exposed to much artificial light, just being right now in front of a screen, that has an impact on our circadian rhythms and how we expose ourselves to this type of light before we go to sleep. Yeah, and also one thing that would be interesting is the impact of stimulation from, let's say, over-information. You know, if somebody's kind of always on social media or reading the news, it's like, you know, that may also have an impact on the
And
how
you
we,
lose your sense of self and time again. Yeah.
yeah, but also let's say if there's a lot of negative news, a lot of you know, tragedies that the media likes to cash in on, well, in that sense, it can also, you know, change the interoception. We might have people who are, you know, feel anxiety, and anxiety could be in the stomach, could be like the heart rate, the sweaty palms, things of this nature.
Yeah, I always like to say in our, let's say, not only industrialized well, nations, but also in this media frenzy we have now. I mean, even let's say 30 years ago, you didn't have a cell phone, yeah? When you
Right.
went somewhere, you could have a newspaper or something, yeah? But then you finished reading the newspaper or a book, and then you just sat around and looked around, you waited for a train or something, or a plane. And now we have, with a cell phone, we can be distracted all the time, 24 hours, yeah? And you never, you're always connected to the world, and the whole world can always connect to you. Yeah? So you're in total resonance with all the other people with information. And there what I like to say is that maybe we've lost the ability to actually wait through empty time doing nothing, because we're so used to being distracted. So I have let's say a 10 minutes bus ride to the city center. And when I'm in the bus, people enter the bus, come in, and it's like a dance choreography. People at the same time sit down and take up their cell phones and look into the cell phones for the next 10 minutes or something.
Yeah.
So every little, even 10 minutes interval that is empty, where nothing's happening, is filled with, let's say, entertainment, news, etc. So you could say you lose the propensity to experience yourself and your bodily self, and to know yourself, yeah, how you feel at the moment, yeah, because you're completely always distracted from yourself and time.
Yeah, and that could be like you mentioned the visual with the cell phone intake of information, but it could also be listening to this podcast, for example. You know, walking, you're listening, and that's also another way. Like you're not by yourself. You have information coming in, and some people are, you know, more the audio learners. So, but yeah, I guess it depends what you're feeding yourself as well, like what you're feeding your brain in this.
The question is, so for example, for this podcast, you could say, okay, now I'm lying down on the sofa and concentrating for an hour to hear something about two people chatting about subjective time, because I have an interest in the topic. Yeah. But then this is something you voluntarily choose to do this, yeah? And you're concentrated for this whole hour. So that's actually quite good. Because you're trained also your attentive system, if you want. But the other way is you're constantly distracted, because let's say you're quickly checking your emails for 10 seconds. Okay, I've already read this, and then you're switching on to some online news, and then you're listening to some music, or music at the same time in the background, and you're switching constantly. And then after, say, an hour of switching between news items and emails and WhatsApp messages, after an hour, it has passed like 5 minutes, but you have forgotten what you were actually doing during that hour. It's dead time. You've forgotten what it is. You killed time. It's really, you killed time.
Yeah.
But with this podcast, you concentrated on one topic, on one idea, and this is actually quite good for your attentional system.
Yeah, so you're mindful of that. You wanted to do that, and you're on one task. And I mean, this is speculation. I don't have proof for this, but I can imagine that besides just killing time, that could also create some harm, some kind of damage to yourself. I mean, the fact that you're training yourself to be distractible, or to be seeking this kind of distractions or entertainment constantly, and not even focusing on one. I mean, it just seems like it could have some bad effects on the brain, but I don't have any proof of this.
I mean, what I would say is coming back to what we talked at the beginning, I think what you get more and more impulsive because you don't learn anymore to wait. Yeah, because you always can get some entertainment, some distraction, and so you don't learn to wait, and you get more and more impulsive. That's what I think actually happens, because then let's say you forgot your cell phone at home, yeah, or your battery has run out. Now you're suddenly exposed to an empty time. Then you get some sort of hysteric or something, yeah. Feel really bad about this, yeah. And that's a typical sign of you lost, like an addiction, yeah, which you cannot fulfill anymore your needs of being addicted to this infotainment you get. And yeah, that's, I think we get more impulsive through this technology.
And that could possibly move over to other other things. Like I'm just thinking of food. Like if somebody is so impulsive, I think it would be difficult to sustain enough attention to do a meal, and it would just be easier to, like, say, order Uber Eats or something like that, and be waiting impatiently for that. So yeah, it's interesting and definitely something to look into. Now, I want to wrap this up and ask you, where do you think the field of research with time perception and time perspective is going right now? What are the trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think what time perception still needs to accomplish, so the researchers in the field, is really to get into having a chapter in a beginner's book for psychology and neuroscience, or in the foundation of neuroscience, having a chapter on time perception. This does not exist. You can have this for every mental faculty, for space perception, for example. So the Mosers, yeah, the Norwegian couple who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, got this for hippocampus and space perception, yeah? Because it was clearly shown the hippocampus maps our spatial surrounding, yeah? And that's how we process space. If you want to find something, if rats move through a maze or we move through a city, we use hippocampus activity, which has mapped out space. Yeah? And you find you have something in agreement for, let's say, people working in on motor systems, people working on hearing or seeing or whatever, or memory, whatever. You have really a consensus on basics, where you could say, oh, this is textbook knowledge. And most people will agree on this textbook knowledge and you will expand on it, but you have something like basic agreement, and you don't have this in time perception. And I think that has to be accomplished in time perception, that you may say, okay, let's say for shorter time, I'm just making this up here, but some people actually agree on what I'm saying. So for shorter time intervals, we need basal ganglia, cortical loops, SMA, basal ganglia, maybe for accomplishing sensory motor timing tasks. That would be accurate in timing. Yeah? And then for longer time intervals of sensing, subjective time, passage of time, you have insular activity. Yeah? So just to give an example, so that people would then agree on, okay, certain time domains, this type of activity, these brain areas, a network of brain areas involved in this, maybe modality specific. Very, very short time intervals are maybe even related to the actual sensory systems, vision, audition, etc. And this agreement is missing. I think this is the main obstacle or hindrance of why time perception still hasn't reached a status that other areas have reached.
Okay, well, that's a great point, and I would agree and say that, yeah, and the more we're learning, at least in my field, about how it ties to ADHD, it's absolutely crucial. So it's and it's interesting that it's been neglected, and I would say that, yeah, it would be good to have it, like you say, in introductory textbooks, and also for clinicians to try to understand how we can work with patients with, working on time and looking at how they experience it and what works to maybe be more adaptive, more functional with the time perception. So yeah. Okay, well, I think that's we're up now. Mark, where can people find your work?
Well, I've got my two books, of course, by both Marc Witmann, and then both at MIT Press, so on Amazon or any other book sellers online, you can find it easily. And then, of course, got a lot of articles, or people who are more scientifically interested, really on the details of the research. Of Google Scholars, if you type in my name, you'll find all my papers very easily. And the two MIT books, of course, based on research, but I think I wrote it a little more popular. So also for the generally interested person, it is maybe worthwhile reading.
Great, and I will definitely include the links in the show notes. And thank you very much for your time with me. I hope it didn't drag on too much.
Thank you, Simon.
And yes, looking forward to more collaborations.
We'll do that. Okay.